Good evening. The median price of a three-bedroom rental in Cambridge today is $3,400, and this is Renters Matter. I'm Chris Schmidt, your host, and tonight we're going to be talking about a little bit of why is new housing so expensive? Now, an obvious reason for why is new housing so expensive is because it can be, right? Like if a developer or somebody builds a house and they can charge more money for it, they will, and that's certainly the case, and that is 100% something that happens. Any individual developer does not really have a lot of control over what types, like how much housing will cost once a project is built, or they do. I mean, they could charge less, but they're making a project, they're going to make money off of it. A lot of that comes down to what does the market bear, but beyond that, there's a component of what goes into how much something costs, which is what actually gets built. What actually gets built as new housing in Cambridge? Because if you look around, there's not a whole lot of it. If you go to a city like Seattle or DC or parts of Denver, what you will find is 15, 20, 30 projects going on at a time. Seattle added more housing units last year alone per person than Cambridge has in the past decade. So we're not building that much housing. Like that is a fact of the world. Relatively speaking, we're building not a lot of housing. But what does get built also tells you something. So what controls what gets built is one of those things that's under the control of the rules that make up what is acceptable to build. On an earlier episode of Renters Matter, we talked a little bit about the fact that Cambridge's rules for zoning indicate that you can't build very much on a given lot without special permission. What this means is that you can't build a 6-unit apartment building on pretty much any residential lot in Cambridge. And what this means is that residential lots in Cambridge or 6-unit apartment buildings or things like what we have don't get built. You do see new single-family homes or new townhomes or other things like that, but you don't see a lot of like small apartment buildings getting created in Cambridge. That just doesn't happen much. What does happen, and what we see and what we're aware of, if you look at areas like North Point, or if you look at Proto, my favorite building in Kendall Square, the tall spire of buildings at 88 Ames, you have these really kind of dense buildings with lots and lots and lots of units. Proto's 280 units. A lot of the buildings out at Cambridge Crossing are 400 units. The new place at Essex Street in Central Square is some larger number of units. And to me, I didn't get it. I thought that the reason that there were all these kind of big developments was just because that's what developers always wanted to build, right? Like that they just are like, oh, well, we can make more money off of this, so we're going to do that. And what I found is that that's actually not the case. What is the case is that there's a middle area here where we see single family homes, we see townhomes. There's a 6-unit condo development on a 1/4-acre lot that got built out near me recently. All of that was as of right. It required no permission from the city, but it's just these 6 little single family homes that are all kind of on one lot, and not something bigger than that, and not something more than that. So on this lot, in other parts of Cambridge, you might see a 25, 30-unit apartment building, but you didn't see a 25, 30-unit apartment building here because you couldn't build that. 6 was the most, and you could only build up to this amount of space. So what does drive these big projects? How do these big projects get built? If you can't build anything, how do these big projects get built? And this comes back down to anything's possible. The reality is that the city makes the rules on what can be built where. It makes the rules on what is allowed to be built and what isn't allowed to be built, and it can change the rules on what is allowed to be built and what isn't allowed to be built. And so what you'll see is that in some parts of Cambridge where development has generally been allowed, if you look at parts of the northeast corner of Cambridge, or if you look at Kendall Square or other things like that, what you see is that what has happened is all of the developers who want to build in that area have asked for special permission from the city to build in that area and gotten that permission. And some of the stuff you have to keep in mind goes back not just, 5 years or 10 years. Some of this goes back 15, 20 years to a time when Cambridge was recovering from being post-industrial. This is before the tech industry and the biotech industry especially had gotten a hold in Cambridge. And so when developers came in and said, hey, if you allow us to build bigger, then we'll build something. And so what you'll see is if you look at the top right corner of Cambridge here on this map, you'll see this is kind of Kendall Square area, and all along here, each of these little things that says PUD next to it was a planned unit district. Each one of these and the number attached to it is a different case where a developer or a small set of developers came in and they said to the city like, hey, we would like to change the rules of what can be built. We would like to change the rules so that we can build more space or more, something. And you'll see that basically all of East Cambridge, all of this area that was redeveloped through the 1980s and the 1990s, all the way up through now in this like PUD 8 area up here, the North Point area, has all been developed, has all been created as a set of changes that were instituted in response to individual developers or groups of developers coming in and saying, we want to do this. And instead of being able to build, 5 units of housing here, we're going to build 300,000 square feet of space, and we'd like your permission, and we're going to do that. Now, these things have to go through, and they have to get voted on by a supermajority of the council. You have to have 6 councilors say yes to them. Many of these were voted through with unanimous support. You have to keep in mind that this is a lot of this dates back to early 2000s when trying to get more jobs in Cambridge and more reasons to be in Cambridge was a goal. Like that we were trying to recover and build this out in North Point as an area with a lot of housing commitments. And so the goal is to try and kind of build this area out. But in order to get these things approved, you've got to convince the city council. Now, one of the ways that you can convince the city council is you can just say like, hey, we think you need office space. We'd really like to build your office space for you. Like, would you like that? If they say yes, great, like no problem, it's gravy, and that's fine. What you see today is not that. Instead, what you see is that the city council is less likely to say yes to new development because, in part, commercial development has been, in the general Boston region, has been a driving factor of rising housing costs. So there's an understandable reason to say, hey, we don't want to just let you build just office space. We want housing in addition to that or something else. But one of the other ways that you can do this is that you can add sweeteners to your deal. Community benefits, they're called, right? So you can add community benefits and say like, oh, well, we know that Cambridge would really like to see the boathouse over by the Galleria, it's been falling into disrepair for many years. What we're going to do, because we're going to expand this building here, is we're going to promise you that we're going to rebuild the boathouse. And we're going to spend $25 million rebuilding the boathouse. We're going to make it a great launching point. Like, we're going to run a whole canoe river program there, and it's going to be great. Or you can say, like, hey, we're going to offer a farmer's market, right? Like, you want something from us. We're gonna host a farmer's market. We're going to program this every day, just outside Kendall Square. There's a farmer's market, so we're going to do that for you, for the city. All these things cost money, though. Like, that money doesn't come from nowhere. Like, that money comes out of somewhere, and in particular, it's going to come out of theoretically, it would come out of the profits of the developer. But really what it is that developers bake these assumptions of how much am I going to have to spend on this into their plans. When they're going to do a big development, they come out ahead of time, and they're like, okay, we can't do this development we have to make at least $87 million on this, and we're going to make $72 million, so we can offer $20 million, and we're going to get, what we need out of this. And they're not going to say like, oh, because we're offering to do the boathouse for you, we're going to build less office space or more office space and less housing. Or because we're going to do the boathouse for you, we don't have as much affordable housing or other things like that. They don't say those things because those aren't very convincing when you go to the council. Instead, they just come in with this great package where they're like, oh, well, we were going to build it this way. And we were just squeaking by at that point. But now we're going to give you these $60 million in community benefits to go along with it. In reality, what that is just them taking money that's coming out of their profits, that's coming out of what they're going to charge for the housing, and integrating it into their whole plan. So what this means is that for these large projects, they don't get built unless there's $20 million in it that they can offer as a community benefit to convince the city council. So the reason that we see all these big buildings is that in order to have enough profit margin per unit or total, in order to make these kind of promises to city councilors, to the city, to take advantage and offer these, benefits to the city, whether it's affordable housing or repairing a boathouse or repairing an empty retail space in a garage or using up parking spaces the city isn't using anyway, other things like that. You've got to have that money in the budget, and if that isn't there, then those projects just never get offered. They just never get built, and they change something else about the project. And maybe what they do is they ask for a taller building, and then they build more offices or more housing. Maybe they do something else, but those are the trade-offs that are getting made. So what does that mean if you just want to build a 6-unit house? Right? Like, I just want to build a 6-unit house on a home, apartment, double wide, triple decker, which is a common style throughout both Cambridge and a bunch of the surrounding region. I want to offer, units like this. What do I have to do? Well, first of all, it's not going to be necessarily the case that I am going to be approved for this, right? Like, I have to go and ask permission. I have to say, I believe this would be beneficial to the city. Here's the rules that I'm following, and here's the rules that I'm breaking, and here's why I think this is beneficial to the city, and go to either the Board of Zoning Appeal or potentially to, the planning board and say, here's my plan, is this okay? And depending on how much more you want to go over the limit, you may have more or less work to do. When you go to the planning board, they're expecting things like pictures of elevation. What is the outside of the building going to look like? Pictures of, what it looks like from the streets, a plan for which trees you're going to remove, and other things like that. So what this means is that in order to go and ask for permission, you have to already have the idea pretty well in hand. And maybe you, all you listeners out there in Radio Land, or wherever this is these days, are experts at, understanding how to draw and draft and be an architect and everything else like that. But I'm not. So if I wanted to extend that to my building, I have to go pay a professional to do that. I have to pay them probably thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of professional time to go and design my building for me and lay out where the bedrooms are going to be and how many they're going to be and where are my connection points going to be and all of that, so that I can go to the Board of Zoning Appeal or to the planning board and say, here's what I want to do. I want to build a 12-unit building, and here's what I want to do. Now, I'm not necessarily going to get permission. So I have kind of two options. If I'm a small property owner, I own a 10,000 square foot lot or something like that, which is actually kind of big in Cambridge, but whatever. I own a 10,000 square foot lot. I can build in many parts of Cambridge 4 houses on it, or I could potentially go and try and design an 8-unit building and get that approved, but I would need special permission in almost all the parts of Cambridge. So if I'm going to go and try and get that approved, I have to say, is it worth it to me to risk it, to spend $20,000 with an architect to do a design on a project, go and have a community meeting, go and have a planning board meeting, go and meet with the Board of Zoning Appeal, whatever, and say, here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do, can I do it? And if they say no, then I have to go and spend more money and say, well, we really think you should do it this way instead. Now I have to go spend more money, change more plans, and do this all over again. And at the end of the day, I now have significant costs that, I have to spend in order to build a bigger building. Or I could just build 4 houses on the lot, not worry about any special rules, just work as of right, is what it's called, where I work under the existing zoning rules, and I can do that. And so this is why you see things like at 125 Brookline, where it's 6 little condos that are all directly under the rules for how much square footage you can have and how many units you can have and everything else like that. So they didn't need to ask for special permission for things because they were just following the rules. And therefore, they were able to save money rather than building a bigger apartment building. If they built a bigger apartment building, if they built a building that, for example, had more units, they would have had to go ask for special permission, and they might have been turned down, so they just didn't do that. So that means these middle-sized projects don't really get built. There isn't enough profit margin in them to make it worth the risk of kind of going and investing in this development. If it's a risk. So instead you build something very much smaller instead under the existing rules, or you go big or go home, right? Like in Kendall Square, Proto is a 280 unit building under one of these planned unit districts that already had the square footage allowed. It was a 14,000 square foot lot and has 280 apartments on it, right? And so in that 10,000 square foot lot that I'm talking about here. Now, granted, there's no way that I would get approval to build a 200-foot tall building in a neighborhood in Cambridge, but in that size lot, you can put a lot more houses. But you're just not allowed to. You're not allowed to unless you're doing it as part of one of these large developments where someone has come in and made a deal with the city that will give you some housing and some office space and a park, and we'll trade this to you, and we'll do this, and we'll, make all these agreements. And we've got these, again, all over, like North Point, Alewife, East Cambridge, and the Kendall Square area. That's how all of these places where new development is going in are basically done. So what's the cost of that, right? Like, what is the actual cost? So one, because you can't add a few more units to an existing building pretty much anywhere, you don't have cases where you just add on a few units. This is like the most probably cost-effective way of creating new homes is not to go build a new building, because new lumber is expensive and labor is expensive and clearing a site is expensive and everything else like that. So the most effective way and cost-effective way to build more homes is to take an existing house and change around a few walls and add a door or whatever else like that. And if you've lived in Cambridge for a while as a renter, you've probably lived in some place where, like my apartment on Alston Street was very clearly like a weird kind of conversion where you went in and you walked right into the place, and then like the hallway went off the side and you didn't really understand it. And if you had removed the wall between the two, like the stairwell up and the entryway, suddenly it all made more sense. Like, oh, now I get it. Like, this was the grand foyer and entryway, and there was a thing over here, but then they turned it into 2 units, and there's a downstairs and an upstairs, and now the whole thing kind of feels kind of funky and odd. And you see this even more if you look in a lot of places where people have done conversions to Airbnbs, where you like walk in and immediately you're like right in a closet because someone wanted to add like another bedroom or another bed to their Airbnb. I stayed in an Airbnb in Washington, D.C., where it's like a 2-bed Airbnb, but the second bed was in the kitchen. It was like where the eat-in living room, where the eat-in kitchen was supposed to be. They just had like a bar top, kitchen, and they were, and that was like where they had the bed right next to it. So like things like that are the most cost-effective way to add more units. And in Cambridge you can actually build ADUs now, that's accessory dwelling units, where you've split up to 800 square feet of your home and said like, okay, this is an additional unit that is, separate from the main house, and so on. And those rules actually passed earlier this year and are one of the ways to build more affordable housing, but you can only build 1 unit on a property that way. California just passed a law actually that you can build up to 2 ADUs on your property, so you can convert your garage or your attic or whatever into another dwelling unit and add more apartments that way. But because other than 1 unit in like kind of bigger single family homes, you can't build an extension on your home, right? Like you can't take a 1-story building and build 2 more stories on it to turn it into a triple-decker in Cambridge, in many parts of Cambridge, because you're not allowed to have 3 units on most properties. So those just don't get built. You don't have medium-sized apartment buildings getting built either, because for approximately the same reason. And anything kind of in the in-between size you don't see built because getting this special permission would not work. Instead, what you see is the big buildings, right? And so like the Cambridge Site Galleria wants to do kind of an office and retail mixed-use development to kind of take over the fact that retail is dying and they've already lost the whole 3rd floor of the mall, and they want to kind of take and build some tall buildings kind of along that corridor along First Street and revamp it to be, rather than like a blank wall parking garage, to be a retail space. So this is like, I think, a really good development for First Street, potentially, if they can pull this off and turn this into a retail corridor where people go out and they have kind of like cafes on the sidewalks and some retail space that's outward facing rather than inward facing, and office space and residential space. They're talking about adding 150 units of housing and so on and so forth. Okay, great. Except for the fact that they, in order to get approval on this, they have to go and they have to convince the city council. And so, one of the city councilors, this is Dennis Carlone, who's currently a councilor, and says that this developer is doubling the size and more than tripling the height for a project they claim is needed to preserve Cambridge side. I frankly don't believe it. Given the scale increase and density and height, this really has to be studied. Now, I'll say 2 things. One, like, understanding the financials of any project in Cambridge, if you're going to give them approval, makes perfect sense. Please, do it for every project. Like, ask them for the financials, look at it, become an expert in what this looks like, so that we can understand how projects actually get built in the city and what impact it has. We should just do that. But, the idea that density and height are things that we should somehow be avoiding. That like, oh, you shouldn't have the height to build more houses. Like, you don't need to build more houses or more office space. Like, you don't need those things to survive, therefore we shouldn't build them. No, we should build them. We should build housing and office spaces to go together. We should build more housing and office space, but revitalizing this building by building more stuff so there are more people who are shopping in that space, so more people who are doing these things, is valuable. But the developer knows that this is the reaction they're going to get. And so they come in and they say, okay, we're going to make half of the housing units affordable housing, and we're going to give you a $25 million boat, house repair project, and we're going to clean up this whole underpass and do a whole art project along the canal there, and all this other stuff. And so they're like, we're going to give you $60 million in benefits. Well, those $60 million in benefits have to come from somewhere. And if you look at the overall project and say, this isn't just a housing project, but if we imagine, just for the moment, that this was a $60 million community benefits package on 150 units of housing, right? Somewhere in there, they're saying, like, we're going to have to get $400,000 per unit of housing out of this. Now, what is the impact of $400,000 per unit of housing on the rental price, on the price of how much it costs to rent? Well, for every $350,000-ish in Boston, you could basically assume that the rent on the apartments at the end of the day is going to go up by $1,000 a month. If that doesn't happen, then the project just won't get built. They won't bid it. They won't request it. They'll close down the building. They'll sell it off to somebody else. They just won't do it. So if someone says to you, hey, we're going to build a 100-unit housing project and we're going to give you $10 million in community benefits, so that's a $100,000 cost per unit, that means that those community benefits are going to cost you $300 per month in increased rent. Like that's just the math that they have to do, otherwise the project doesn't get built. So we could build smaller buildings or build extensions or do anything else like that, but you can't do that because of the rules. We could build medium-sized buildings, but nobody really wants to because the risk is high and the money isn't there to be able to do these bargains with counselors. And so you're left with just these big projects done by giant developers with big pockets that can spend $1 million designing a building and having these back and forth with the counselors. This Cambridge Tech Galleria thing's already been going on for 6 months. They're paying lawyers. They're paying, all of this stuff. You're going to have community meetings and talk with people. You may hire a representative to try and figure out what the project should look like. You've got to do all these plans, and that's all people time. All that people time is going into somewhere, and so at the end of the day, you're going to have $1 million into this, or $2 million, or in a case of a project in San Bruno, California, they had invested $10 million and 4 years in a process to try and get approval from the city council on something. It was 450 units of housing, no office space, no anything else, 25% affordable, and eventually the city council came back and said, well, I don't think you're building enough parking, so we're just going to kill this project. They invested $10 million going back and forth for 4 years trying to appease the council and trying to create a project that people were actually supportive of, and that was just lost money to that real estate developer. They just lost that money, and they weren't a huge developer. They weren't like a national brand or anything else like that. And that $10 million has to come out of, or they go out of business, their other projects. Right? So when you have these people going back and forth and having community meetings and all this other stuff, all of which is important, and I'm not saying it's not, it's all coming out of the pockets of the people who rent. And when people are offering things to repair things that should be maintained by the city, a boathouse on public property, or improving a beach, or creating a new plaza, or other things like that on public land, or not on public land, but providing these services, those things are coming out of those new development, coming out of these new apartments, when the city has, in some cases, failed to deliver on, providing these basic services, right? The boathouse has been falling into the river for the past 25 years. Nobody doesn't know it. The city could fix it. They could fix it and they could turn it into a great spot, but they haven't. And they haven't because, in part, they know that they can get these kind of promises out of developers, when instead of all that cost going on to the people who are buying the newest apartments or are moving here for the first time, or are students who haven't lived here for the past 45 years and are trying to get in here, or if they're new condo units, making the condo unit prices higher, instead of that, the city could invest that money. They could raise the taxes, property taxes for everybody by 3%, get a bond, make it a 20-year bond, and say we're going to do this, raise taxes by 1 or 2%, 2%, and they could provide these services themselves. And then it would be spread among everyone who lives in Cambridge. We'd all be paying, rather than just the people who are new, moving here, looking for apartments, whether they're, students or immigrants or migrants, coming from other towns, someone who got a job here, all these other things. We could spread that load, but instead we kind of put it all on the new housing. So what does this do? Well, it stops new housing from being built. The reality is that Cambridge doesn't build a lot of housing because building housing here is so expensive. And it's not just these community benefits, it's also things like our in affordable housing inclusionary requirements. They do the same thing. The developer is going to make less money off of those units, and therefore the price of their other units are going to go up, or they're just not going to build. And what we've seen in Cambridge for the past 2 years, since we increased our inclusionary unit rate from 12% to 20%, is that nobody comes and builds housing here anymore. Unless they're doing cross-subsidization with office buildings or something else like that, where they're going to make a ton of money and they can put some housing in as a sweetener, they just don't build housing anymore. Because we've made it impossible to build anything small. You can't take a 20% cut in your profit if you just don't have that much profit. And we've made it so that you have to come through and get permission from all these different people in order to make it happen, and you don't know ahead of time. So you're taking a huge risk if you try and do this. So this is why new apartments are so expensive. They're expensive because you need special permission, you need to invest millions, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in getting projects through. You have to beg for permission from the city council because nothing is really allowed just by following the rules. So you have to make new rules every time you go. This means that only those with the deepest pockets can develop, only those with the most incentive to kind of, control the narrative, participate, and you've changed the whole thing to, instead of being a kind of rules of, well, we want more housing so everyone can just go build it, you've made it so that only people who have deep pockets can do so. And with counselors like Dennis Carlone, who says we have to really be careful about giving away height and density, like height and density are free. Like you can build up, we've got a whole lot of up to go. Like we're not at the level where we're building into space, we can do this. But because we are scared of our own shadows, we don't. And that's a real cost to renters. I'm Chris Schmidt. This is Renters Matter.